I start my song as every poet chooses, by calling on the company of muses. Oh, come into my heart, I bid you please, bless this fresh tablet balanced on my knees. Make sure the fame of this huge contest carries the handiwork of that warmonger Ares to every ear as I set forth the tale of how it was the mice came to prevail over the frogs' amphibian alliance, a feat to emulate the earth-born giants, according to the legends men impart. Thus begins a work that, though almost unknown in our day, used to be one of the most important works that would make up anyone's schooling for many centuries. I refer to the battle between the frogs and the mice, long thought to have been composed by the poet Homer. This is a lovely modern edition of it that has beautiful illustrations by Grant Silverstein and a very lively translation that's also very playful. For example, when it said to tell the tale a bit before, he spelled tail T-A-I-L. His conceit is that this was actually written by a mouse, and that's why we've been unable to determine who the author of this text was. But it was written by some ancient Greek poet, probably not, almost certainly not during the Homeric period, several centuries later. And it's a mock epic that is on the model of the Iliad. And for many years, this would have been something you would give to kids as you were trying to get them into the epic poet tradition. They would read this text as a way of getting a feel for what that's like. It was actually, its history is more interesting after the Greek period than it is during the Greek period. For example, starting in 800 AD, this was used as a textbook for young readers in Byzantium, in the Eastern Roman Empire. And so in Constantinople, any children going to school learning how to read, this would be the book that they would cut their teeth on as they were learning how to get good at Greek. From Byzantium, it made its way back into Europe at the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance, and this became the first book printed in Greek in Europe in the year 1474. That edition was made in Florence more than a decade before the first editions of the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greek came out. The particular version that was printed in Florence was a facing page edition. It had Greek on one side of the page and Latin on the other side of the page. And that was because of how the text was to be used. The text was used in schools by children who were learning Greek. They would have learned Latin from a fairly early age, such that all of their studies could then be carried out in Latin. So by the time they've reached what we would consider middle school age, perhaps, they've gotten good enough at Latin that they can just sort of do whatever. They can read in Latin, they can have all of their courses, hear all their lectures in Latin, and present their recitations and their homework and everything in Latin. And so the Greek and Latin edition printed in Florence was one that would then be given to those students who were now starting their study of classical Greek, and the Latin text would help them to figure out what was going on in the Greek text as they were putting that together. That edition spawned numerous other editions, and those editions eventually turned into translations, and it began to spread throughout Europe. In the Renaissance as well, the great writer Erasmus, who is one of the leaders of the leading champions of the Greek movement, he actually refers to it in a letter to his good friend Thomas More in England. And he refers to it as an argument, as an example, that even great poets like Homer were not above writing parodies. They considered writing in a parodic vein to be something that was worth doing. So for many centuries, this was something that all of the great thinkers of Europe would have encountered early on in their studies as a way that they were being introduced not only to ancient Greek, but also to ancient Greek verse. As a result, it was very influential because it was a text that everyone knew, and it was a text that was coming into people's lives at a time when their imaginations were really being shaped, and they were thinking about how to do things. Now, of course, the model for education back then was that you learn by imitation, and so you would write verses in this style as a way of learning what it's like to write epic verse, and they would write epic verse in Greek as they were learning to read Homer and other works. But also then that crept into other things that they did. It became a very influential work on other works that we do still read today. For example, Thomas More's own Utopia is influenced by the style of this work, as is Swift's Gulliver's Travels. In fact, I would even go so far as to argue that the rhetorical debates between Luther and Erasmus around the theological debates of the Reformation were also influenced by this. That a lot of the ways in which they spoke to each other, it wasn't so kind, and they came to making fun of one another, and they drew upon this text, among others, in those debates. In fact, you can actually see its influence much more recently in T.H. White's The Once and Future King. The first part of that, which is The Sword and the Stone, features a series of chapters in which Merlin is changing the young King Arthur into a variety of animals so that he can experience how their societies work. And the idea is that Arthur is learning about ruling and ruling well from seeing how the different animals do it, whether they do it well or poorly, and he's getting to see different types of governments played out. One of those episodes, which was actually added into the book after World War II, as a response to the events of World War II, features two colonies of ants who wind up going to war with one another. And wouldn't you know it, when you look at that text and the way that's laid out, the war between the ants is an echo of the battle of the frogs and the mice. So it's quite a remarkable history this book has had, and it's been deeply influential, and yet it's fallen off of our syllabi. We're very fortunate we do still have, it is still in print in a good modern edition. I think this one is simply delightful and is suitable for use with younger readers. But it's not primarily about bringing this book back to younger readers. Let's do that. That would be great. But it's also about the fact that this is the part of the chain. This is the part of the transmission of the Western tradition. And we're reading works that have been influenced by this work without the knowledge of this work, and that creates a gap in our understanding. So I commend to you for your study the Battle of the Frogs and the Mice.